The greatest test of a police department does not happen when everyone knows who is watching. It happens when nobody knows who is standing in front of them. On a quiet Monday afternoon in the heart of the state capitol, a man in a simple navy jacket walked along the sidewalk carrying a small leather folder and a cup of coffee in his hand. To everyone passing by, he looked like an ordinary citizen going through an ordinary day. But this was not an ordinary man. His name was David Carter, and he was about to discover something that would challenge everything he had spent his career building. David had spent more than 3 decades in law enforcement. He had worked the streets, trained new officers, managed departments, and eventually became the state police commissioner. Yet, despite reaching the highest level of leadership, he never forgot where he started. He believed a leader could not understand a system by only sitting behind a desk. A leader had to see what happened when nobody knew their name, their title, or their position. That was why David occasionally visited public areas without announcing himself. He wanted to observe real interactions. He wanted to understand how people were treated when there was no reason to show special respect. That afternoon, he walked near a government complex in downtown Springfield, Illinois, watching the movement of the city around him. People rushed to meetings. Cars moved through busy streets. Workers carried on with their routines. Everything appeared normal, until 2 police officers approached. Officer Ethan Walker stepped forward with the confidence of someone who believed he already understood the situation. He had spent years wearing the uniform, and many people considered him experienced and decisive. But experience could create 2 different outcomes. It could create wisdom, or it could create the belief that a person no longer needed to listen. Ethan looked at David and saw only what was visible. A man standing alone. A person without a uniform. Someone who appeared to have no influence. He did not see the decades of service behind those calm eyes. He did not see the responsibility carried by the man in front of him. David noticed everything. The tone of the conversation. The assumptions made before questions were answered. The difference between protecting public trust and simply expecting obedience. But he remained calm. He did not mention his position. He did not use his authority to change the situation, because this was the moment he had been looking for. He wanted to know what happened when a person was treated as if they had no power at all. The encounter lasted only a short time, but David understood that important lessons often came from ordinary moments. A badge could show someone's role, but it could not guarantee someone's judgment. A title could represent authority, but it could not replace character. As Ethan continued the conversation, he had no idea that the man standing in front of him was the very person responsible for leading the entire state police organization. He believed he was speaking to someone who had no influence, but David Carter knew the truth. Sometimes the most revealing moments happen when people think nobody important is watching. The conversation on that sidewalk lasted only a few minutes, but for David Carter, those minutes revealed more than hours of meetings ever could. He had spent years studying leadership, training officers, and building a stronger relationship between communities and law enforcement. Yet there was one question he always returned to: what happens when nobody knows who is watching? After leaving the government complex, David did not immediately contact anyone or make a public statement. He simply continued walking through the city, carrying the memory of every detail he had observed. The way questions were asked, the way assumptions were made, the way quickly a person could be judged before their story was understood. For David, those details mattered because they represented something larger than one interaction. They represented the everyday experiences of people who did not have a title, a position, or a voice that automatically attracted attention. Meanwhile, Officer Ethan Walker continued his normal routine, unaware that the brief encounter would soon become one of the most important moments of his career. Ethan believed he had handled the situation professionally. In his mind, he had simply followed his instincts and responded based on what he saw. But David understood that instincts needed to be balanced with patience. A first impression could be useful, but it could also become a barrier that prevented someone from seeing the full truth. Over the years, David had witnessed how good officers could slowly lose perspective. Many entered law enforcement with the desire to serve their communities. They wanted to help people and make a difference. But some eventually began to measure success by control instead of trust. They focused on being obeyed rather than being understood. David believed that was where leadership had to step in. A strong police force was not created by people who never made mistakes. It was created by people willing to recognize mistakes and improve. Later that evening, David sat in his office reviewing reports from across the department. The city lights reflected against the windows as he looked through information about training, public feedback, and officer interactions. He was not searching for a reason to punish anyone. He was searching for the truth about the culture he was responsible for leading. The encounter with Ethan remained on his mind because it represented a question every organization needed to answer. Did the values written on paper truly appear in everyday actions? David knew that a department could have excellent policies, impressive buildings, and respected leaders, but none of those things mattered if people were not treated with fairness in the moments when nobody was paying attention. The following days would bring a closer review, but David wanted the process to happen naturally. He wanted facts, not assumptions. He wanted understanding, not quick conclusions. Ethan still did not know the importance of the moment he had experienced. He did not know that the person he believed had no influence was carefully examining the very system he represented. And he certainly did not know that the quiet man in the simple jacket was about to reveal a truth that would change the way everyone viewed the situation. Because sometimes the most important lessons begin when people believe the person in front of them has nothing to teach them. Long before David Carter became the state police commissioner, he was just another officer learning what it truly meant to serve. He remembered the early mornings, the long shifts, and the moments when a simple conversation with a citizen could reveal the strength or weakness of an entire department. Those experiences shaped the leader he became. David never forgot the feeling of standing in front of people who did not know his name, his position, or his future. That was why he believed the most honest test of leadership happened when titles disappeared. Growing up in Detroit, Michigan, David was raised by parents who taught him that respect was not something a person demanded. It was something earned through consistency, honesty, and the way they treated others. His family did not have wealth or influence, but they had strong values. They taught him that success meant more than reaching the top. It meant remembering the people who helped you get there. When David joined law enforcement, he did so because he believed a badge represented a promise. It was a promise to protect trust, to listen carefully, and to understand that every person had a story beyond what could be seen in a single moment. During his early years as an officer, David noticed something important. The best officers were not always the loudest or the most confident. They were the ones who remained patient when situations became complicated. They were the ones who understood that every decision had an impact beyond the moment itself. As David moved through different levels of leadership, he carried those lessons with him. He became a trainer because he wanted younger officers to understand the responsibility behind the uniform. He became a supervisor because he wanted to create a better environment for both officers and communities. Eventually, he became the person responsible for leading the entire state police force. But despite the title, David continued to believe that leadership required humility. He did not want to become separated from the reality experienced by everyday citizens. He knew that sitting in an office could make it easy to believe everything was working perfectly. Real leadership required stepping outside and seeing what was actually happening. That belief brought him to the streets where he encountered Officer Ethan Walker. David was not surprised by the interaction itself. What concerned him was the possibility that the same experience could happen to someone who had no ability to question the system afterward. Someone without connections. Someone without a respected position. Someone whose voice might never reach the people responsible for making changes. As David reviewed the situation in his mind, he thought about the purpose behind his entire career. He had never wanted power for the sake of power. He wanted influence because he believed it could be used to create fairness. The encounter with Ethan was not simply about one officer and one citizen. It was about a larger question that every organization had to answer. Were its values real when nobody important was watching? David Carter knew the answer would not come from speeches or written policies. It would come from what happened next. The days following the encounter between David Carter and Officer Ethan Walker passed quietly on the surface, but behind the scenes, important questions were beginning to take shape. David did not rush to make announcements. He did not call attention to himself or use his position to influence the situation. Instead, he followed the same principle that had guided his entire career. Before making a decision, he wanted to understand the full picture. Inside the state police headquarters, David began reviewing information connected to everyday interactions between officers and citizens. He looked at training records, community feedback, and internal reports. He was not searching for one person to blame. He was searching for patterns. He knew that a single moment could reveal something much bigger about an organization. As he reviewed the information, one concern became clear. The issue was not only about what happened on that afternoon. It was about whether officers throughout the department were consistently applying the values they were expected to represent. David understood that every police organization faced challenges. No system was perfect, but strong organizations were willing to examine themselves honestly. The dangerous moments came when people stopped asking difficult questions because they were uncomfortable with the answers. Meanwhile, Ethan Walker continued his regular duties, unaware that the encounter had gained the attention of the highest level of leadership. He believed the situation had ended. From his perspective, he had handled another routine interaction. But David saw something different. He saw a moment that revealed how quickly assumptions could replace understanding. Ethan had not known David's background, his experience, or his position. He had only seen what was in front of him and formed a conclusion. For David, that was the exact issue he wanted to examine. How many other people experienced the same thing when nobody recognized them? How many citizens walked away feeling unheard because they did not have a title that opened doors? These questions stayed with him as he continued the review. A few days later, David met with senior officials to discuss the next steps. He emphasized that the purpose was not punishment. The purpose was improvement. He wanted the department to understand that accountability was not an attack on officers. It was a responsibility shared by everyone who carried public trust. During the meeting, David asked a simple question that changed the direction of the conversation. If the person involved had no connection to leadership, would we still examine this situation with the same level of attention? The room became quiet because everyone understood the importance of that question. Fairness could not depend on who someone was. It had to exist because fairness was the foundation of public service. As the review expanded, more details began to emerge. Some officials realized that the encounter represented more than one conversation on a city street. It represented a challenge to the culture of the organization. David knew that real change would not come from one meeting or one decision. It would come from recognizing problems, accepting responsibility, and choosing to do better. And while Ethan still had no idea who David truly was, the truth was moving closer every day. Soon, the officer who believed he had judged an ordinary citizen would discover that he had been standing in front of the very person responsible for judging the future of the entire department. The internal review continued moving forward, but David Carter understood that the most important answers would not come from a single conversation. They would come from looking carefully at the details that were often overlooked. In his office at the state police headquarters, David sat through hours of reports, listening sessions, and discussions with department leaders. He knew that every organization had challenges, but he also knew that strong leadership required the courage to recognize them. The goal was not to create a story about one person failing. The goal was to understand why certain decisions were made and whether the system encouraged people to make better choices in the future. As the review expanded, officials began looking more closely at Officer Ethan Walker's history within the department. Ethan was not someone who had always been viewed negatively. In fact, many people described him as dedicated and experienced. He had spent years serving the community and believed he was doing important work. But over time, confidence had slowly turned into certainty. He became someone who trusted his own judgment more than the perspectives of others. Small concerns had appeared over the years. Some involved communication. Others involved the way he approached difficult situations. None of those moments seemed significant enough on their own to create major change. They were brief comments in reports and conversations that faded away with time. But when viewed together, they created a clearer picture. David understood something important about leadership. Problems rarely appear suddenly. They usually develop through small moments that people choose to ignore. That was why he refused to focus only on the afternoon when he met Ethan. The encounter was a window into a much larger issue. Meanwhile, Ethan continued believing that the situation would disappear. He did not know that the person reviewing the case was the same person he had spoken to on the street. He did not know that the quiet man in the simple jacket was examining the culture of the entire department. Ethan prepared his explanation based on what he believed happened. He expected the matter to be handled like many other internal reviews. But this time was different. This time, the person searching for answers had spent his entire career understanding the difference between authority and responsibility. David eventually decided that a formal review process was necessary. He wanted independent voices involved. He wanted facts organized clearly. Most importantly, he wanted the department to see that accountability applied at every level. A person's position should never determine whether their actions were questioned. As preparations began, the atmosphere inside the department changed. Officers started asking questions among themselves. Leaders began reflecting on their own decisions. Everyone understood that something important was happening, even if they did not yet know the full story. David looked over the documents one more time before the next stage began. He thought about the reason he had chosen this path decades earlier. He had never wanted to lead because of the authority attached to the position. He wanted to lead because he believed systems could become better when people were willing to face uncomfortable truths. And soon, Ethan Walker would discover the truth that would completely change his understanding of that ordinary afternoon. The person he thought had no influence had been watching, listening, and learning from the very beginning. The day of the formal review arrived with a sense of uncertainty throughout the state police headquarters. Officers moved through the building knowing that important discussions were about to take place. But most of them did not understand the full significance of what was happening. They knew there had been concerns. They knew leadership wanted answers. But they did not know that the person guiding the entire process was the same man who had been quietly observing the department from the outside. David Carter entered the review room without the attention usually connected to his position. He did not want the moment to be about his title. He wanted it to be about the facts. Around the table sat department officials, advisors, and representatives responsible for examining the situation. Officer Ethan Walker arrived prepared to explain his actions. He believed he was entering another routine review where his experience and reputation would speak for him. He did not expect the conversation to become something much larger. The review began by examining the details of the encounter. Every decision, every conversation, and every response was carefully considered. The purpose was not to create embarrassment or assign blame without understanding the full situation. The purpose was to discover what happened and why it happened. Ethan explained his perspective. He described what he believed he saw that afternoon and why he made the choices he made. His words showed confidence, but they also revealed something important. He had focused on the situation in front of him without considering what he might not know. David listened quietly. He had heard similar explanations throughout his career. He knew that many problems began when people believed they already understood everything before asking enough questions. Then came the moment that changed the entire room. A senior official introduced David Carter not as a citizen connected to the review, but as the state police commissioner. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Ethan looked across the table, realizing that the person he had treated as an ordinary citizen was the very leader responsible for overseeing the entire organization. The realization was not about status alone. It was about perspective. David had chosen not to reveal his identity because he wanted to see the truth without influence changing the outcome. He wanted to know whether the department's values remained the same when there was no obvious reason to show special respect. Instead of using the moment to criticize Ethan personally, David focused on the larger lesson. He explained that leadership was not about having the ability to avoid difficult situations. It was about having the courage to face them honestly. A strong organization was not one where mistakes never happened. It was one where people were willing to recognize them and improve. Ethan sat quietly as the meaning of the situation became clearer. The person he underestimated was not trying to prove that he had more power. He was trying to show why power had to be handled carefully. David reminded everyone in the room that every citizen deserved the same level of respect, whether they were known, unknown, influential, or simply passing through their community. As the review continued, one truth became impossible to ignore. The real test had never been about how officers treated the state police commissioner. The real test was how they treated someone they believed had no authority at all. The room remained quiet after David Carter revealed his identity, but the silence carried a different meaning now. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of reflection. Everyone inside the review room understood that the situation was not about one person's title or one officer's mistake. It was about the responsibility that came with every badge, every decision, and every interaction with the public. David looked around the room and made something clear from the beginning. The review would continue the same way it would for anyone else. His position would not change the process. His title would not change the standards. The facts would determine the outcome. For Ethan Walker, that message was difficult to accept. He had entered the room believing his experience would explain everything. He believed that because he had spent years serving as an officer, his judgment should automatically be trusted. But as the discussion continued, he began to understand that experience alone was not enough. Experience had value only when it was combined with humility and the willingness to consider another perspective. The review team examined the details carefully. They looked at the encounter, the decisions that were made, and the reasoning behind them. They also examined previous concerns that had been documented over time. The goal was not to create a story about one officer being wrong. The goal was to understand how certain habits developed and how they could be corrected. David explained that every organization faced moments where it had to choose between protecting its image and protecting its values. A department could not improve by ignoring uncomfortable information. Real improvement required honesty. It required leaders and officers to admit when something needed to change. Ethan listened as David spoke about the purpose of authority. A badge was not a symbol that placed one person above another. It was a reminder that the person wearing it had accepted a responsibility to serve everyone fairly. The words affected Ethan because he realized the biggest lesson was not about David's position. It was about the way he had viewed the situation before knowing the truth. He had changed his understanding of the moment only after discovering who David was. But the question remained, would he have shown the same respect if he had never learned David's identity? That question stayed with everyone in the room. Because true fairness was not measured by how people treated someone important. It was measured by how they treated someone they believed had no influence. David did not use the meeting to make himself the center of attention. He used it as an opportunity to challenge the entire department. He reminded everyone that leadership was not about being feared or recognized. It was about creating a culture where every person received dignity before anyone knew their background, position, or achievements. As the review moved closer to its conclusion, the message became clear. The greatest test of the state police force was not how it responded when its highest leader was present. The greatest test was how it treated people when nobody knew who was watching. The days after the review brought a different atmosphere throughout the state police force. The attention was no longer focused only on what happened during one afternoon. Instead, people began discussing what that moment revealed about leadership, responsibility, and the importance of public trust. David Carter understood that a single meeting could not transform an entire organization. Real change required patience, honesty, and a willingness from everyone to look closely at their own actions. He did not want officers to leave the experience feeling afraid. He wanted them to leave understanding why their choices mattered. Inside the department, conversations began taking place about communication, decision-making, and the relationship between officers and the communities they served. David encouraged leaders at every level to listen more carefully. He reminded them that most people never saw the training sessions, the policies, or the meetings behind the scenes. They only experienced the department through individual interactions. That meant every conversation mattered. Every decision mattered. Every moment could either strengthen trust or weaken it. Ethan Walker spent time reflecting on everything that had happened. The realization that David was the state police commissioner had changed the way he viewed the encounter. But the deeper lesson went beyond David's title. Ethan began to understand that respect should not appear only after discovering someone's importance. Respect should exist before any introduction, before any achievement, and before any explanation of who a person was. For years, Ethan believed confidence was one of his strongest qualities. Now he understood that confidence without reflection could become a limitation. A person could be experienced and still have more to learn. A person could carry authority and still need to listen. David saw this reflection as an important part of growth. He believed accountability was not about creating permanent judgment against someone. It was about giving people the opportunity to recognize problems and become better. The purpose of leadership was not to find people who never made mistakes. The purpose was to build a culture where people had the courage to correct them. During a final conversation with Ethan, David shared a message that stayed with him. He explained that the uniform represented a promise to the public. It represented fairness, patience, and service. It was never meant to become a barrier between officers and the people they were responsible for helping. Ethan listened quietly because he finally understood the difference between authority and leadership. Authority could make people follow instructions. Leadership made people believe in the purpose behind those instructions. Outside the department, many people viewed the situation as a powerful reminder about fairness and accountability. But David saw it as something even more important. He saw it as a chance for an organization to examine itself honestly. He knew that a stronger police force would not be created by avoiding difficult conversations. It would be created by having them. As the department moved forward, David continued his work with the same belief that guided him from the beginning. A person's value should never depend on whether others recognize their position. True character was revealed in the moments when there was nothing to gain and nobody important was watching. And that was the lesson everyone inside the department carried forward. Months after the day that changed the way many people viewed leadership inside the state police force, David Carter continued doing the work that had always defined him. He returned to meetings, community discussions, and the daily responsibilities that came with leading a large organization. He never wanted the story to be remembered only as a moment when someone discovered his identity. He wanted people to remember the lesson that came before that discovery. A person should not need a powerful title before receiving fairness. A person should not need influence before being treated with dignity. That belief became the foundation of the changes that followed. Across the department, officers and leaders began focusing more on communication, patience, and accountability. Training programs placed greater attention on understanding different perspectives and recognizing how important every interaction could be. David knew that policies alone could not create trust. Trust was created when people saw those principles reflected in everyday actions. He often reminded officers that the public did not experience the entire department. They experienced individual moments with individual people. Those moments shaped their understanding of law enforcement. Ethan Walker continued to serve while carrying the lesson from the review with him. He realized that the greatest mistake was not failing to recognize David Carter. The deeper mistake was believing that a person's importance depended on whether their identity was known. Before that day, Ethan had viewed authority as something connected to position and control. After the review, he began to understand authority differently. True authority came from responsibility. It came from listening. It came from recognizing the value of every person before knowing their background or achievements. David did not believe one conversation could change everything. He understood that growth required time. Organizations, like individuals, had to continue learning. But he also believed that meaningful change always started with one honest moment. One moment when people chose to look deeper instead of making assumptions. One moment when someone decided to listen instead of immediately judge. The city eventually moved forward, as cities always do. New stories replaced old ones. New challenges appeared. But the message from that afternoon remained inside the state police force. It became a reminder that leadership was not proven when people recognized your name. It was proven when people treated you with respect before they knew anything about you. David continued walking through communities, speaking with people, and observing the world beyond his office. He remained committed to the same principle that had guided him throughout his career. A badge could represent authority, but it could never replace character. A position could provide influence, but it could never guarantee trust. Trust had to be earned through actions repeated every day. In the end, the most important lesson was not about one officer or one leader. It was about the choice every person made when facing someone they believed had no power. Because true justice was not measured by how people treated those who could affect their future. True justice was measured by how they treated those they believed could do nothing for them. And that was the moment everyone inside the department finally understood. The strongest leaders were not the ones who needed to announce who they were. They were the ones whose actions revealed it before anyone ever knew their name.